conflict in the Middle East, but also how China, AI, Bitcoin, and the future of the monetary system are affected with Matt Pines. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Layer. I'm Nick Bhatia. Today we welcome back Matt Pines, Bitcoin Policy Institute. Matt, good to see you.
Good to be back.
All right, let's talk about what's going on around the world. Israel, Iran. I want to start there because, well, why don't you just kick it off for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, well, first of all, like whenever the missiles start flying, everyone says, is this World War III, right? And, the first order where people look at the price of liquid assets like Bitcoin and, you get kind of that fear limbic response, right? Like, is this going to escalate? Are we going to go into a global conflict? And I'd say like the default attitude that I have to any of these sorts of periodic geopolitical flashpoints is to sort of fade them in terms of their like immediate, strategic, sort of tipping point into catastrophe. But that's not to say that, we aren't in a new regime of elevated uncertainty, right? And I think this is a particular episode in a long-running story where geopolitics is now driving the macro, right? And so your audience is very interested in, the macro, the Fed, interest rates, the economy, and in normal environments where trade is flowing freely, where there's occasional flashpoints in local conflicts, but fundamentally the rules of the global system are kind of well understood and abided by all the major economic and sort of industrial and military powers. Then you can kind of keep those things on the margin, and the economy kind of just keeps chugging along. And we've been in a regime since COVID where that's just fundamentally not the case. And so I view kind of the Iran-Israel conflict as just another case study in this larger theme where the great powers are essentially going at it. Ever since Russia-Ukraine, maybe since COVID, you've seen the emergence of a much more explicit delineation of competition and conflict around the Eurasian periphery between kind of the legacy kind of maritime, liberal, oceanic powers, dominated by the U.S., kind of G7 system, being challenged by kind of a loose alignment, not really an axis per se, but a loose geopolitical alignment that spans the Eurasian sort of autocratic powers, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China in particular. And we see kind of this arc of instability, across that entire regime, going from the Arctic Circle, the North Sea, to the conflicts explicitly in Eastern Europe, through the Middle East, through India, Pakistan, China, Taiwan, North Korea, etc. And so that arc has both kind of explicit conflicts that we see where missiles are actually flying and people actually dying, to more like latent hostilities, subterfuge, political warfare, cyber attacks, sabotage, undersea cable cuts, space, etc. And so the Israel-Iran conflict has its own local character, its own deep history of sort of adversarial relationships in the region. But as a reason why it matters geopolitically in terms of like, well, does it not stay local? Does it pull in larger powers? Does it, for example, pull in the United States? Right, that's kind of the big strategic question at issue here. It's the same question with Russia-Ukraine, right? If it's just Russia-Ukraine, okay, it's just a local conflict. But of course, it pulled the United States and other Western powers in, and it was always this risk of escalation, right? Will at various points Putin, try to escalate outside of Ukraine? Will the U.S. Keep adding up different levels of support to Ukraine? That's been the main driver of strategic instability and risk. And that conflict is the same driver of strategic instability and risk in this conflict. And so I think that is the main criteria for where this like trips a different threshold. The last point I'll say is that these are also conflicts that are being waged in as leverage points against other conflicts, right? Because there's a certain high table of geopolitics now that Trump, and that's the model of geopolitics that Trump has in his head, isn't kind of the traditional little sort of Western liberal order where there's kind of a mesh of alliance relationships. And while there's like a background understanding that it's an implicitly hierarchical quasi-imperial system between, say, us and the Five Eyes and the sort of constellation of allies and partners that we have, military bases, et cetera, there's at least a genuflection towards the similar sort of political ethos that we all share, mostly Western liberal countries, and that we'll cooperate, we'll sort of invite them to our big summits as peers, etc. And I think Trump has taken a very different tact and approach to countries that he views as fundamentally subordinate to the United States, and where essentially he can dictate rules to them. They have to kind of take the rules that the U.S. issues, whereas there are rivals in the global system that Trump views as essentially co-equals, or at least folks that he has to, bargain in a different way with. And so there's a reason why we now have effectively sort of a tariff arrangement with China that may be even more favorable towards China than the one we have towards Japan at the moment, right? Seems kind of counterintuitive. If Japan is an ally, why are they getting kind of a worse deal than China at the moment? It's because he can impose a worse deal on Japan, and he can't impose a worse deal on China. So the last point I'll say about the Israel-Iran conflict in particular is, Trump is looking at this global chessboard to a certain extent, and he's seeing, the main rivals that he's got to kind of deal with at the high table that are on the other side: Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. And he realizes, well, okay, he's trying to settle the conflict in Ukraine, but Putin isn't all that cooperative. He's tried to declare this trade war to reset the terms of global trade and the overall geoeconomic relationship and technology competition relationship with China. And he's found that wasn't as easy as he thought, maybe, with post-Liberation Day, instability in the bond market, and then the clear demonstration of power that China has over rare earths. North Korea, he sort of went toe-to-toe with back in his first term, and there was this fire and fury. My nuclear button is bigger than yours, and there was like pretty close brinksmanship to nuclear war. North Korea actually has nuclear weapons, and so of the four, like Iran is like the weakest, doesn't actually yet have a nuclear weapon, and that's at least in the public has been the main proximate trigger for this recent escalation of direct hostilities. But it's like of the four, it's kind of the easiest to kind of pick off potentially, right? And Israel is sort of chirping in Trump's ear, kind of telling him a pretty compelling story for him that we've systematically weakened Iran's position in the region by knocking out all their proxies post October 7th. And now we're in a position of a strategic overmatch where we've established, air supremacy. We've been able to sort of wipe out large swaths of their command apparatus, 40% more of their ballistic missiles and their launchers. And now we need to basically, from Bibi's perspective, like go all the way and take out the nuclear program, and maybe even flirt with quote regime change. And from Trump's perspective, right, this is kind of like, all right, maybe this gives me more leverage vis-a-vis these other more difficult rivals to bargain with, right? Maybe this gives Trump more leverage over Putin in Ukraine, and maybe because China is the major importer of oil from Iran, about a little bit less than 2 million barrels of oil a day, that gives him kind of a similar kind of choke point supply chain point of leverage that can kind of counter the rare earths supply chain leverage that China demonstrated. So I don't think there's like a master grand strategy here. I think though that Trump is like looking for where he can maximize advantage. Whether he's doing this adroitly, how much is being manipulated, how much of it's a fictitious strategic advantage, like, remains to be seen. But that's kind of my view of the situation, right? Missiles flying back and forth grab the headlines, but it's like, well, why, right? And what else is sort of at stake here in terms of the ambitions that the powers that be here have to open up new corridors of trade, right? So like the IMEC corridor going from India through the Middle East to Europe has been like a major strategic priority to kind of counter China's Belt and Road and kind of their own geoeconomic sort of trade lines that they've been sort of building throughout Eurasia, connecting to the Middle East and into Africa. That's been viewed as a strategic threat to kind of the Western organized system. And so they had this idea of IMEC that they actually put together in the Biden administration. And it was basically rendered somewhat moot after October 7th because it was contingent on all these different normalizations between Israel and Saudi, and agreements over Gaza, and be able to get pipelines through Syria, and like a lot of other things. And that was kind of derailed. And maybe there's like a hope springs eternal in minds of some of these grand chessboard like strategists that if you can actually knock out Iran, that maybe that kind of vision of an alternative geoeconomic order where the Middle East is fundamentally opened up, right? Where the prospect of this kind of persistent threat of a conflagration, goes away. Iran's proxies are muted, and then Iran itself kind of becomes a much more defanged, regional power. This is okay. Well, go after their oil, right? Then we can explore the natural gas in the area, and then we can, really counter China and squeeze them out of the air. So like, there's a lot of like big ideas that people have. I get it. I also have caution because I've seen this episode play out in periods of history where a lot of folks sitting inside, conference rooms and secure facilities in DC, looked at, the prospect of knocking out Saddam, and this being, this big, strategic unlock for the region and, and oil, and it didn't work out that way. So imperial hubris and kind of the one weird trick doesn't usually work out. But that's kind of my current sort of 10,000-foot level view of the situation. I guess the last point is, by the time this airs, right, like it all comes down to what will Trump actually say join a strike on, say, Fordow, and then what will be Iran's response, if any. I mean, this is kind of a matter of really high stakes signaling. I think Trump has drawn a line somewhat clearly in the public, although it's been a bit ambiguous of what his objectives are, like denuclearization, commitment to, not pursue a nuclear weapon and come to the bargaining table, right? Maybe with a bit less leverage on the Iranian side. Israel's objectives may be a bit more expansive than that. They've, flirted with the topic of regime change, although it doesn't seem to be a clear strategic objective at the moment. It's basically denuclearization, defanging of the proxies, taking out their ballistic missile threat, and creating the political conditions potentially for a more pliable sort of Iranian regime. But there's a dynamic here where each iterative successful next step kind of opens up the aperture for policymakers and national leadership to consider going further, right? The idea of striking Fordow, before Israel took this kind of bolt from the blue strategic surprise, was like not even considered because of the prospects for massive Iranian counter attacks and response. And so every day that Israel grinds down the ballistic missile, takes out key leaders, cyber attacks their banks, undermines their political sort of confidence in the regime and the mass population, lowers the threshold for Trump to consider more explicit strikes. He's moved a lot of forces into the region, the Nimitz, a lot of tankers and strategic bombers. So he's putting a lot of pressure, and he's sort of implying that he could, if he wanted to, go after these facilities and maybe even support other strikes on the military apparatus. It's all about like, well, okay, what is the threshold by which Iran considers that like a total declaration of war by the United States, and therefore reserves the right to retaliate in kind in a more asymmetric fashion, right? Say by mining the Strait of Hormuz or precipitating large-scale terrorist attacks in the West using their Hezbollah proxies. So that's the real like failure mode or kind of tail risk scenario here. I think most of the probability distribution is on the like they ante up, hit the nuclear facilities. Trump feels like he got a clean win without dragging America into another massive conflict, without creating doubling in oil price spikes that lead to inflation, et cetera. So I think he's trying to find that right line. It's high stakes though. So you hope that they make smart decisions.
Is Bitcoin's next parabolic move starting already? I want you guys to go check out this report at unchained.com/TBL about liquidity. Now, it uses a slightly different methodology than we do at TBL, but I really think that you guys would benefit from checking out this report and understanding Bitcoin's relationship with liquidity. Unchained and TechDev break it down in a new report. Visit unchained.com/TBL to get that report right now. The Financial Freedom Report is a free weekly newsletter from the Human Rights Foundation. It tracks how authoritarian regimes are weaponizing money to control their populations and suppress dissent. It also spotlights how technologies like Bitcoin are helping everyday people reclaim their financial independence and freedom. A one-of-a-kind newsletter connecting the dots between financial repression, geopolitics, and emerging technology. Smart macro analysts don't just watch the Fed, they watch the world. Go to financialfreedomreport.org to sign up for the free newsletter. So, do you believe the claim, or can you speak to the claim that Israel was planning this for 9 months? And for the viewers and listeners, we're going to continue on this topic because Pines is able to bring in the US, China, and the global geopolitical order throughout the conversation. So we don't have to make this a regional conversation uh, exclusively, but the next few will be along those lines. So speak to the claim that Israel's been planning this for 9 months, and then give us your prediction. You've mentioned regime change a few times. You've mentioned the probability distribution where you are leaning. So give us more of an explicit just prediction. You can hedge it as much as you want. But what do you think is going to happen? And then if you can mix in also the idea that what should be the U.S. goal here? Should it be intervention? Should it be an alliance with Israel? Should it be to stay out? So if you were the president, how would you be operating as well? So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so the former is like purely kind of predictive and descriptive. The latter is more normative and kind of a policy recommendation. So I'll kind of put on two different hats, right? One is as an analyst, one is on like, a hypothetical if I was a leader kind of hat. To the first, right? Well, and then to the first point of like, was this like a long running play? Like, I think definitely Israel's military and intelligence system has been, treating Iran as like their primary strategic adversary for decades. And so they have been operating covert intelligence activities and pre-operational preparation of the battlefield for, like on a continuous basis. I think this flipped though post October 7th, and they had obviously the massive incursion into Gaza to go after Hamas. Then there was the conflict with Hezbollah, and then there was kind of a joint Turkish kind of thing in Syria that kind of systematically weakened, if not like wiped out, most of the effective military capacity of Iranians' regional proxies, as well as in Yemen, like the Houthis. They're not as much of a strategic threat given the distance, but they've been able to launch some missiles and drones, et cetera, at Iran. And there's been a number of Israeli strikes as well, back and forth. But Iran has been the top of the mountain, right? And so we've seen Israel able to demonstrate a number of these, really, I think just from an objective basis, like impressive technical capabilities for strategic surprise and long run clever intelligence operations, leveraging their technological capabilities and their deep penetration of their adversary systems, like with Hamas and with Hezbollah, in particular with the pagers, for example. And then this combined, kind of covert operations, special forces, and intelligence activities, and the sort of bolt from the blue strike. That was, I think they were planning that for many, many years. I think, like all these intelligence plans, you constantly revise them as you get maybe a new network or a new asset or a new capability, or you figure out some like technique, like with drones that didn't exist before. And there was actually an interview with Dmitry Alperovich, with a former like chief of military intelligence for Israel. He was a famous like Air Force pilot. He's kind of very well respected, kind of senior general intel guy. And he talked about how like, this was like a constant kind of planning activity inside the Israeli system. But he said he was very surprised by how quickly and how effectively, Israel's basically would establish air supremacy in like less than 3 days over a power that is like whatever 3 times the population, maybe more, geographically much very far away from them. They have to fly over a lot of other Arab countries. So like objectively like an impressive military operation, and like really kind of like pants the Iranian military. And so I think this is like a lesson that a lot of countries are now relearning of like the possibility of using AI, these technology breakthroughs for drones, really advanced surveillance and reconnaissance with different sorts of platforms, and like extremely precise targeting to really like strike the fear of God in a lot of people, where it's like, we know where you live, we know where you sleep, we can put a warhead on your forehead while at your apartment, like without hitting anybody else next door, or maybe sometimes they have some collateral damage. But that changes the calculus of a lot of people, not just in Iran, but a lot of other conflicts around the world. I think we saw Ukraine able to kind of smuggle in and then launch a bunch of pretty low cost drones and wipe out like a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet, including pretty far flung areas away from the main conflict. And so this is the way of war. The kind of Jeff Booth thesis of technology deflation means that the cost capability curve for asymmetric military platforms is continuing to go down or go up, depending on how you draw the ratio. But it's like changing the game, right? And so the countries that are at the technological frontier or they're able to leverage and synthesize and operationalize these techniques are finding that they're able to convert them into strategic advantage. That's what we've seen. Now, what happens next? The scenarios, right, in terms of Trump right now essentially is doing his negotiating bluster. We saw this with North Korea, right? He was going to the mattresses. He was like, move everything you need to move in, talk to the CIA. The CIA was doing like an invasion plan. Like the orders were given back in 2016, 2017, as the tensions with North Korea ramped up to like actually prepare for like effectively nuclear war with North Korea. And they were dusting off old invasion plans and trying to like find, like we're talking the special forces and figuring out all sorts of new techniques to kind of put into theater. And Trump was, tweeting about my nuclear button's bigger than yours. And there's a lot of anxiety inside the national security establishment at that point of just how close we were going to get to war with North Korea. And then he decided, okay, I'm going to go back from the brink and we're buddies and we're going to send love letters, right? And so Trump's negotiating style in these geopolitical conflicts seems to be one of Brinkmanship. He's willing to kind of go pretty close to the edge, and it's at least rhetorically. And it's very hard to tell, right? How close is that to, true strategic flip, right? So moving all these assets in theaters, Diogo Garcia, they're evacuating the Qatari base. That could be a target of Iran. They're just today, they're evacuating personnel from Iraqi embassies and consulates. So they're doing all the things that you would do if you're preparing to strike Iran and then expect to counterreact. And so everything they're doing is a signal that they expect to basically hit Iran somewhere, right? And so I think everyone's focused on Fordo. That would be like the least surprising strike in the world. I think every day that goes by that Iran doesn't give some accommodation signal to Trump, the more and more this gets likely. So I would say my baseline scenario now is that we're talking on Thursday afternoon, midday, that sometime in the next 48 hours, we could see a strike on Fordo, maybe over the weekend. I think it's kind of this week between now that the assets have been moved into theater. It's kind of like, okay, Trump has now sent this signal. And the question is, does Iran call his bluff or not? Right? Because now he's moved the assets into theater. It's meant to say, I can strike you at any moment. Come to the table. And if Iran says, buzz off, well, then Trump is kind of put in this position where he kind of has to strike them, or else it looks like his bluff was called. And so those are intense signals being sent, like as we speak, to the Iranians saying, like, we've got all the assets in place. We're ready to basically knock out your nuclear program and maybe even set other aspects of your military back significantly, and maybe even fundamentally weaken your regime's stability. Like, come to the table. And if Iran says, buzz off, well, then he kind of has to hit them, right? And then we're in this regime of, okay, Iran's counter response would have to happen. They would, the threshold that they're trying to set is, does U.S. hitting Fordo, for example, does that trigger Iran mining the Strait of Hormuz? Because that would objectively bring U.S. like into the full-on regional conflict, and other parties would be like, well, okay, now we have to ante up. The UK would come in, and then we would be in a regional war. And there, I think we're in the scenario where like a regime change operation becomes more likely, because essentially Iran has burned the bridges. They've decided to basically cut off 20 million barrels of oil a day. A lot of the region's economy, even China, would start to freak out. And so that's the risk scenario, right? I think there's a hope that like there's an off ramp post Fordo where there's an agreement to do civilian enrichment, nuclear program, maybe some sanctions. That was kind of the deal that Trump wanted to put on the table. He had the meeting that was going to be set up with Witkoff before Israel struck. I think Trump in his lizard brain wants to get back to that, but he knows that in the moment he can't show weakness. So he kind of has to ante up militarily. The problem is Israel, I think, has every incentive to kind of like keep pulling us more and more in, because they've gone maybe as far as they can go. They can probably keep, attriting some of the Iranian missiles. They kind of can keep, maybe they could hit Fordo with themselves with like some special stuff, but it would maybe be a low probability of success. Maybe they could do a ground insertion with special forces to take it out. Again, higher risk operation. So they could decide to do this all on their own. They would much, much rather have U.S. back at their back. And Iran is a big country. So just because they got kind of smacked in the face and were kind of like surprised and shocked almost by the pace of Israel attacks, doesn't mean that they couldn't, sort of absorb and then try to reconstitute weeks, months down the line. And Israel only has so many of these, David Sling and Arrow and different interceptor missiles. Like there's a certain amount of capacity that they have, and it's an industrial process to generate a lot of these missiles and interceptors. And so it's like just with all these other conflict scenarios where it's like a big smack, and then it's like, oh, surprise, somebody got advantage in the beginning, and then it's okay. What's the equilibrium if there's no strategic settlement of the conflict? Then it sort of settles into this kind of war of attrition. And because Iran and Israel don't have like a land border, they're really far apart from each other. It's just basically a war of attrition between who can, keep hitting each other's missiles and each other's missiles interceptors. And like, what's the loss curve of like the reconstitution ability of each side to be able to launch ballistic missiles on one side or do different, long range strikes and bombs dropped on Iranian facilities. And so you can have the situation where it kind of like just kind of peters to like that state where they kind of each run out of stuff, right? They each run out of ballistic missiles, and then Israel runs out of defense, and there's kind of this race to kind of catch up. And then periodically they keep launching stuff back and forth. So that's my kind of baseline scenario, is that we will probably hit Fordo, and then you're in this new branch that goes either to escalation or a deal. And then, there's also wild cards where Bibi could just decide to throw a monkey wrench in and just kill Khomeini. They'd rather not, because he's got the legitimacy of the regime. He can be the main negotiating partner. And so if he can flip, the rest of the system flips. If you kill him, who's going to replace him? Could it lead to just like, an automatic triggering of massive escalation regardless? But yeah, this is where we're in this sort of period of nonlinearity here. Now, what I should do, right? I think as a meta principle, my objective as national leadership is to, okay, like I am where I am now, right? Like I can't go back the clock and be like, well, we should have done X, Y, or Z in the months leading up to this, put more pressure on Bibi, maybe do some other preparations, etc. There was like the IAEA announcement, there was the 60-day, thing, and then this was 61 days after kind of that grace period, and then immediately we just launched stuff. So you can do like the coulda, woulda, shoulda, but you're asking me like, if I'm Trump today, like what do I do? I think his options are pretty limited, right? My options are pretty limited at this point. Like you've already moved your assets into theater. You've committed to send this signal. It's either a credible signal that you're going to back up or not, right? I think the most important thing is not to get yourself like led by the nose by another country who wants to basically substitute their foreign policy for yours, right? Like the U.S. has certain strategic objectives. I think Iran not having a nuclear weapon is one of those strategic objectives. But destabilization of Iran as a country and the triggering of a wider conflict and economic, catastrophe is definitely not in the U.S. strategic, interest. Like Israel, Iran is the top of the mountain thing. U.S., Iran is an important thing, but it's not the top of the mountain thing. Like China is the top of the mountain thing. So the real strategic failure mode here is we get sucked into a conflict that draws all of our assets, all of our resources, saps his political capital domestically. And then China is basically comes out like massive W, right? And then we effectively don't have the credibility anymore to deter a Taiwan invasion. And so I'm looking at the sort of the macro play, and I'm like, okay, maybe you're in the moment now. You can't back out because that will send the very worst signal. Probably have to go and hit Fordo. But I think if you do that, you have to basically send a very strong signal to both Iran and Israel that that's going to be it, right? That they won't support any larger strikes, no more targeting of the political leadership, and then you dangle a carrot in addition to the hammer. So almost at the same time that you say that you hit Fordo, you give a deal. You give a sanctions, sort of relief. You allow, some amnesty for some of the, like the mullahs that, are worried about getting, more assassinated by Israel. And you try to kind of reset the table for a deal. It's hard. Passions can, be inflamed when you're getting, bombs dropped on your head. That would be like, I think the optimal approach at the moment, like given where we are. Right. But I think the overall strategic mandate has to be preventing the U.S. getting sucked into a wider conflict and preserving a set of strategic priorities vis-a-vis China and the Middle East.
Now, we will run this on Thursday, Pines. We're recording this here on Thursday, June the 19th. You mentioned IMEC. Can you explain what that stands for. And it seems that whenever we chat, it does come back to Belt and Road and what the U.S. is doing to counter it. So I found it interesting what you were describing with the counter to Belt and Road potential in that region of the world, as well as laying in this concept that, okay, regime change might not be the best way forward, but if regime change isn't the best way forward, maybe you don't get this entire block of the Middle East that is a perfect area for the counter for Belt and Road. So can you discuss that?
Yeah, so the latter point is much more explicit, right? Like regime change has a pretty poor track record. So it's good in theory, very, very, very poor in practice. And Iran is a pretty modern country relatively, right, in terms of its population, their level of education, their level of civilization. They're run by a theocratic monarchy with a pretty radical IRGC military or paramilitary wing attached to it. And so there's kind of this do it all at once versus bend the trajectory towards more cooperative economic development. The IRGC is both a paramilitary kind of terrorist group, but it's also like a business conglomerate. Like they own lots of economic, valuable properties and front companies and businesses throughout the region. It's lots of rich IRGC guys that like to vacation in Europe or whatnot. So like the caricature of them as a bunch of terrorists in a cave, right? Now, like they're a mafia, right? Essentially, right? They're a mafia that has certain both political objectives, ideological objectives, and economic objectives. And so the game of geopolitics or political negotiation is to try to appeal to maybe more the rational self-interest of any group, right? It's like we all want to get rich, we don't want to die. It's kind of a basic human kind of objective function that everyone has in their heads. Some people are totally ideologically committed to suicidal war, but those are, I think, a small minority. So I think there is a prospect that you could have, you put Iran under pressure and then negotiate, and then you negotiate a deal, and it's like, okay, we don't want to have a war anymore, right? You can't have a nuclear weapon, and you're not going to be friends. But we sort of commit to a stabilization of relations where the prospect of, outright regional conflict and economic catastrophe is taken off the table. And that's in everyone's mutual interest, right? And I think a lot of folks in the Middle East, between the Gulf countries, they have this idea of kind of this grand bargain, for example, in the region that could settle some of these beefs, not necessarily make everyone friends, but then allow a lot of investment to flow and turn the Middle East into kind of this entrepot connecting East and West. And that's kind of been this idea behind the IMEC corridor. It's kind of India, Middle East, Europe corridor, like an economic zone. That's like a high level framework, a high level kind of conceptual kind of geopolitical idea that would, be kind of a logic of connection to bring commodities out of the Middle East to both to the East and to Europe, build redundant more kind of economic and trade links, as well as like lay fiber optic cables. If AI is going to become like a major future thing, which it will, the Middle East is doubling down on AI. Like the deal in Riyadh that was signed is a massive multi-$100 billion deal with the Emirates and the Saudis, kind of going pretty all in on AI in particular. And so that involves a massive build out, taking advantage of their prodigious energy infrastructure and their large amounts of capital, and putting that into, frontier AI training models and inference distribution in a region with a lot of young populations and potentially, a lot of economic growth connecting into Africa, into Europe, into Asia. And so the logic of the Middle East is that it's always been this connector. It's always been kind of this diffusion sort of zone with a lot of different geopolitical blocks, and the Turks and Europe and Africa and Asia. It's all kind of collides in there, and so that's not going to go away. And so it's like, okay, if you can squash some of these beefs and you can lay out this corridor here, then the Western system, quote unquote, with its geopolitical allies in the Middle East and India can kind of benefit. China has been trying to do their own version of this, with kind of different variations of extensions of Belt and Road and the Digital Silk Road. And they've been trying to peel off certain, one-off deals with the Emirates through their CBDC project that brings in the Saudis as well. Like Project Enbridge, CBDC that connects central bank to central bank and sort of a hub and spoke with different national banks. They're doing a lot of bilateral investment deals on high technology. There's a ton of Chinese companies setting up in the Emirates and in Saudi. A lot of like joint high technology investment. So there's kind of, China sees this as like a digital great game, and they want to play, but China's far away, and they have a lot of shipping capabilities. But a lot of the countries in the region still know that there's like 40,000 U.S. troops and aircraft carriers, and if there ever is a situation like with Israel or Iran, China's not going to be there providing THAAD missile batteries, right? China's not going to be there yet with like a credible military kind of umbrella, right? And so that's the one strength America does have. Kind of when things get hot, America has these capabilities to deploy to protect its friends, so to speak. So that's kind of, I think, where this sits now is, China has been trying to peel off the Middle East. They've made some inroads there. I think the AI story has really pulled most of those countries back into US's camp for now. There's a lot of, from my perspective, fraught aspects to those arrangements. Like the Emirates is very much like all in with Sam and Microsoft. Sam Altman, G42 and G42, building these 5 gigawatt data centers to train Sam's AI God in 2027. And then the Saudis have gone all in with Elon and A16Z. And so there's kind of this factionalization and kind of political economy tech oligarch kind of, they're all picking their own champions. And they're trying to build their oon sovereign stacks. Like the connected Bitcoin is like, these countries are looking at the digital civilization that we're building to, while we still fight kind of medieval style wars with 21st century drones. But the vision of the digital economy and digital civilization, essentially, you need energy, you need compute, you need intelligence, and you need money, and that's all going to be digital, right? It's going to be integrated in this full stack. And so being like digitally sovereign in the 21st century is going to be, do you have access to relatively cheap and plentiful energy? Can you build a compute layer on top of that energy? And can you build an access to a money system that is sovereign and durable against geopolitical conflict and monetization of legacy sovereign debts? So you have this energy, compute, Bitcoin, stablecoin kind of matrix being established. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of like the vision for some people. That is like, okay, get them on the America stack and build this kind of Bitcoin, stablecoin kind of network effect, and keep China, gold, CBDCs, block them out, and leverage some of the capital that they have to support our strategic interests, because we are a twin deficit country with a vulnerable bond market. So yeah, this has been the story of like geopolitics always. Was it bombs, barrels, and bonds? Basically, like that's what runs the world. Is sort of the relationship between those three things. And we're dropping lots of bombs. It's to first order over barrels of oil, and the main kind of macro and financial like consideration is, what does it mean for the bonds, basically. And so a lot of the things that Besant is trying to manage, integrated statecraft is like is a verb or as a noun, but like they're trying to turn it into a verb, and it's harder to turn integrated statecraft from a noun to a verb.
All right, that's a perfect segue to ask you a little bit more about the future of the monetary system. You mentioned gold there. You mentioned Bitcoin. So where are we in the grand scheme of going toward a Bretton Woods 3? And I have written down here a question for you also, that is the new multipolar world in your eyes a U.S. versus a bloc, or a U.S. versus a mix of individual powers, then potentially making the U.S. relatively quite strong, as opposed to versus a bloc, which would make it less strong, per se? And then before you even get there, Pines, if you wouldn't mind, you mentioned Brinkmanship earlier in the episode. Can you give us a book recommendation or two? I always like to get one or two from you that you think apply to our conversation today before you go forth with the Bretton Woods answer.
Book recommend, I would say, there's a lot. I'm looking at my bookshelf here, for inspiration. There's a lot. The one that I kind of keep referring to, it's a bit abstract and high level, but it's extremely deep, is a book called Global Discord by Paul Tucker, who is the number 2 at the Bank of England. I have it back there on the shelf. It's a thick book. It's heavy. It's quite intellectual and dense and somewhat abstract, maybe even philosophical at times. But it's basically grappling with this question of central banks in an era of geopolitics and declining political legitimacy, right? Which I think is a question that Bitcoiners are, very much primed to, right? We're very focused on geopolitical risk and the shifting multipolar system. And we're also, I think, fundamentally, at odds with the existing legitimacy of the monetary institutions, right? And the lack of trust in these mandarins and technocrats at the central bank to make good decisions on behalf of everyone and guiding towards a productive economy. And he's from inside that system, and he's kind of giving a very kind of measured and very kind of intellectual jeremiad against his colleagues and his own institutions. Basically, like a wake up call to them. Is like, the systems are changing. The world that you were trained in and grew up in and are sort of now in position to manage are going to be buffeted by these dramatic shifts. And so you need to find a new anchor point and a new logic and framework for legitimacy if you want to keep your role. He's basically like, it's now or never for you, right? A central bank, this sort of elite technocratic class in the West. And so he tries to articulate a positive vision, a kind of try to rebuild and reframe the value of sort of these sorts of systems, institutions, but like on a different basis than just we're smarter, we have PhDs, like you should trust us, right? And that's actually a relation to the answer I was going to give to your other two questions, which is like, like Bretton Woods 3, and how is it going to be negotiated, or who is negotiating, and where does Bitcoin sit in? And I think the models we have for these sorts of geopolitical and monetary arrangements / agreements, we go back in history, and we call it the Bretton Woods threes because there's like been a series of these things. We could go back to the 30s and to the 1945, and then Nixon and the Nixon shock, and then the Plasma Accord, the Louvre Accord, and they're all basically variations of a theme of a bunch of important people, very small number of them, all dudes, from a certain set of very powerful institutions, all meet somewhere at a fancy hotel or whatever, and they go for like a week, and they go, the system's about to break. Like, it's in our collective interest to kind of design a new system. And that new system will sort of somewhat reflect the prevailing power distribution among that group of people and what they view as kind of the mix of interests, right, that need to be preserved in this new regime. And that's kind of then the basic template. I think one fundamental, flaw in modeling things like a Bretton Woods 3 is that maybe the capacity to do that kind of thing doesn't exist anymore. Like, it's because the nodes of power in the global system aren't as concentrated as they used to be, especially not in that kind of like elite class of like, technocrat managers who could just be like, all right, we're seeing some trouble in the gold pool, and we're seeing some issues with the bond market. And so like, the top 20 finance ministers and their deputies come and, we hash it out over a week. Now we're in a world where we have because it's a fundamentally multipolar system. Those types of people are coming from a much wider swath of countries who are not nearly as geopolitically aligned as they were during the Cold War, where you could just, kind of jam Japan and just sort of force them to kind of do some financial repression and deregulation that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise done. In fact, I think the main finance minister who negotiated that deal, he gave like a deep bow like 10 years later at like one of the 10-year anniversary meetings, said like, I deeply apologize for basically what I did to like ruin my country. So like, I just think we have the capacity to get everyone in a room and like make a grand deal anymore. You've got, tech oligarchs that are quasi sovereigns that are almost, the tail wagging the dog geopolitically. We talked about, Elon and Sam Altman and Microsoft and A16Z. Like, they're sort of there are actors in the global system that have their own strategic objectives. They're not just the pure monetary ones, and they can move hundreds of billions of dollars of capital around, which has a monetary effect. And they're sort of rewiring capital markets and technology networks. And so the Fed and these institutions like the Bank of National Settlements and kind of these technocrat sort of systems and these models, like, I feel like they're fundamentally growing mismatch between those systems and their models and reality. And then the structures of power that are distributed across, formal geopolitics, national governments and their ministries, and these, quasi-sovereign tech oligarchs, and then these like free agents like Sheikh Taknoon, who's like the, Emirati, super spy minister of everything, who runs a whole portfolio of G40, probably controls $2 trillion of assets, and is running all these deals. And so we're in a very different world where, like, I don't know if you can just get everyone to like Mar-a-Lago and like reset the terms and have everyone agree. And so my model is then a much more chaotic, kind of dynamic, evolutionary kind of process where nobody really has the ability to get everyone in a room and like come up with like the new deal, right? It's going to reset the terms. They would like that. I think there's lots of people that have visions of what that could look like. I mean, Zoltan Pozar is still writing about these. Sometimes even I have ideas about how this could work. But then I look at the world and I'm like, I just don't see us getting in a room and agreeing to anything like this. And to a certain extent, that's kind of bullish for Bitcoin, because Bitcoin doesn't require that, right? It will create and then respond to this dynamic network of evolving incentives that I think are similar and self-similar at all scales, like up to national leadership. So the same sort of logic that like you and I, went through to acquire Bitcoin is kind of the same logic, right? Roughly to first order as the logic of, a national government, right? That has a lot of other procedural issues and bureaucratic constraints to actually action that decision, but it's not fundamentally different. And I don't know, I have conversations with folks. I just briefed a whole gaggle of legislative aides and directors and staffers for Congress about Bitcoin specifically, and the strategic logic of acquiring it is like, look, we have 4 to 5% of the total gold stock, international reserves, and that's just like an insurance policy that we've kept on our books. And we acquired it for relatively cheap early on, and we just held it there, right? And if you envision a scenario where it's not implausible for Bitcoin to monetize to reach parity with gold over a time horizon that's relevant for a country that matters, that wants to exist forever, well, then it makes sense to acquire a similar amount proportionally of Bitcoin, which would be 4 to 5%, which is about 1 million Bitcoin, which is what the Bitcoin Act says. And so it's like you have this complicated geopolitical, geoeconomic rearrangement, and then you're like, all right, distill it down. There's a new asset that's being monetized in the global system. It's digital gold, right? There's lots of other aspects of Bitcoin that I know are very important. We care about a lot, but like for, to sort of try to dumb it down for these people, it's like digital gold. You either think digital gold is going to be a real thing or it's not. It's either going to fail in some way, it'll cap out, it'll reach some sort of saturation point well below that, in which case, didn't work. But there's a scenario where it does get to parity with gold. And in that scenario, well, it should sit on our balance sheet just as much as gold sits on our balance sheet as this option, as this hedge against destabilization, the legacy system, which is why we have gold on our books, basically. And so that's like a pretty clear logic that I think works, right? It takes a lot for people to kind of grok this, because we haven't, like, even gold hasn't really been a thing we explicitly wanted to talk about as a monetary metal since 1970s, right? We still value the gold certificates at their 1973 values of $42.22 an ounce. And so there are these changes are slow, and then all of a sudden. And I think I was having a conversation with a very influential sort of hedge fund guy, kind of comes out of kind of this dynasty of very influential hedge fund guys. And, he's not like a Bitcoiner, like dyed in the wool guy, but he has it in his portfolio as a significant part of this thesis of kind of this barbell, Bitcoin and gold, devaluing fiats, financial repression, geopolitical fragmentation, multipolarity. Like, this is just like kind of almost a baseline scenario now for like the guys that are constantly going back and forth to, have these high table conversations. And for him, so he gets it. But again, those guys are the guys that get at the cutting edge, right? It takes a while for that to trickle through these administrative bureaucracies and the political systems, who are very much slow to get it. So this is what we're seeing, is that we haven't really had a monetary regime shift in decades. And the last time we had one, our systems of power, our institutions were very much more concentrated, I think, able to kind of meet in a room and just kind of go, okay, flip. We're not in that world. So I just sort of expect it to be very much a chaotic system where people self-organize around a new idea and they see how far it can go, like Street Bitcoin Reserve. And then maybe that gets a certain reflexive mimetic energy inside that system, and it catches on. And then it drives political action because they understand the sort of mutual incentives at play. And we're at the very beginning of that process, but like, it's fragile, it's frail, right? Like, it's like everything else. It has to kind of get momentum, and the external conditions have to be favorable. And so we are, in a new regime where that's much more favorable than it was before, but doesn't make it inevitable. But I think, the aperture of uncertainty or the amount of options on the table are much wider than they have been for someone like, say, Scott Bessent, who, you look at Liberation Day, and he had a certain set of policies that, the administration was going to pursue, and they had a certain assumption about how that would work, and it didn't work. And so then he had to come in and be like, all right, well, now I have to kind of start talking about buybacks to bring down the MOVE index, volatility in the bond market. That was major concern for them. And now he's constrained, and now he has to do these different deals. He's kind of working on the back foot. So when you're confident, when you think the plan is working, the kind of somewhat radical outside the box idea isn't going to be the thing that maybe you turn to. It's when like plan A fails and plan B doesn't seem to be working that you're like, okay, what else is out there, right? That maybe what I wouldn't have gone to first. And, my whole bit at BPI has just been, okay, let's just like make that option like a viable option when the political and national, conditions are right. And then it can flip very quickly because, if the U.S. decides to actually make good on the check that it sort of wrote in March with the SBR, well, China's paying very close attention to this. The Middle East is paying very close attention to this. Lots of other countries are paying close attention to this. I talked to the sovereign wealth fund of a major Western country. This is like it's shifted from being like crazy, not even possible, to being like not crazy but unlikely. Right? But that is an important shift. Once it's possible but unlikely, now it's in the span of okay, I can talk about it. I can like consider this. I need to ask an internal question to my ministry about what if Bitcoin becomes a thing. And it's only a 10x from here to become gold parity at current gold prices. Bitcoin does 10x's pretty regularly. And if the U.S. government decided to, wanted to make that happen, it could do it, with a flick of its wrist, basically. So, yeah, I think we're in a world of nonlinearity, and so making predictions is not about paths; it's about like end states. And I basically my whole shtick has been an end state for Bitcoin in the political horizon of current national leadership is plausible close parity with gold. It's just like with the AI thing, right? So I had a conversation with the vice president, and he, talked about some of the things we were talking about on stage at the Bitcoin Vegas. It was really an honor to get, a shout out from him, our organization. And my whole framing was just, Bitcoin is one of these asymmetric technology curves that sneaks up on you, right? It can start from the trivial outside the Overton window and become a strategic question pretty quickly. And the analogy is AI. Right? AI started as this kind of less wrong blog post. Okay, maybe we'll have AGI in 10 years and it's going to transform civilization. And it was like the preserve of these like autistic nerds obsessing about a far future scenario. And the politicians were like, that's, I don't need to pay attention to any of that. Just like Bitcoin, a bunch of autistic nerds obsessed with this, potential for this radical transformation that's coming, down the line. And then AI has sort of hit that curve. And now it's like plausible in the minds of some policymakers that they could have massive strategic disruptions, economic disruptions, political disruptions from AGI, like in their current term of office. And now it matters acutely to them. Like, well, okay, I need to get smart on this. This matters to me, right? And Bitcoin hasn't quite tripped that threshold. It's like almost there. But my point is, it's like AI 2-3 years ago, where it doesn't take a whole lot for all of a sudden it to be looming very close, like very large in your mind. Right? If Bitcoin just goes to 200,000, I think, roughly, it'll be the second largest asset in the world below gold. I don't have the exact numbers in my mind, but, roughly 3 to 4 trillion. We'll, push it above NVIDIA, these big FANG stocks. And then it's just gold and Bitcoin at the rank of the largest single assets in the world. And that could just happen kind of almost quietly, right? I mean, Bitcoiners would definitely be obsessed with the $200,000 Bitcoin price, but like not much would change in the world. Policymakers might not even really it's another number there. But all of a sudden now you're in a different regime where now Bitcoin is being normalized as a global reserve asset. And it's on the top of the stack of global assets. And from there, like another 2 or 3x is not inconceivable, especially when sovereign wealth funds start, potentially allocating in size. And institutional portfolios and kind of the regime shift for, major wirehouses and brokerages and things that can, normalize it in traditional finance portfolios start to like really, really kick into gear, which is just now happening. And I'm just like, we don't want to have strategic surprise. Just like with AI kind of snuck up on policymakers and they're like, oh shit, now we have to do all these deals with the Emirates and the Saudis and kind of give away some geopolitical deals. I don't want to have the same thing happen with Bitcoin. Like we should get in, establish a structural advantage early at a relatively low cost. And then we have that upside, we have that convexity, right? We have that upside payoff strategically. And all we have to do is kind of like look around that corner a bit, like look 2-3 years down the line here. And, politicians, right, they respond kind of limbically to like what matters to me in my next election cycle. And so it's about painting this picture and making it real. And it took a while for AI to kind of land and be like, make it real for people. It took these kind of wake up call moments. I think 100K Bitcoin was one of those, but it was just the first. I think you need another 1 or 2 of these to like trigger. So anyways, that was a bit of a ramble, but that's kind of my shtick.
I started the Bitcoin Layer in 2021 with the mission to help narrate the path to $1 million and a more Bitcoin-centric global order and financial system. And what you have done, Matt Pines, for us today is help people see what happens between the point where when I started the company, when Bitcoin was somewhere between 0 and 100,000, what happens at 100,000, what happens at 200,000 when Bitcoin gets to 4 trillion, and then yes, it will become larger than any single equity. And I would note, Pines, that while gold is up there above 20, the U.S. Treasury market is even one step higher at 30. So let's not forget that asset class, even though it's not one instrument, you're correct. But then what happens between 200,000 and 1 million, and not necessarily what happens, but why, and the speed at which it happens, and the geopolitical drivers of those changes. We are in a fast changing world. What has happened over the last 12 to 18 months has taken Bitcoin to a new realm than where it was when I started the company in 2021. And so we are here to narrate it for you, bring you guests like Matt Pines that can help see the future. We can't see it clearly. It's cloudy. It's impossible to predict. But as Bitcoiners, we do have a tendency to be able to see ahead. And our views are vindicated as Bitcoin takes each 100 billion to 300, 500 billion step higher in market cap. Matt Pines, thank you so much for joining us today at the Bitcoin Layer. We appreciate your insight. Please tell us where they can find your excellent work and research online at the Bitcoin Policy Institute.
Yes, well, thank you for having me and let me kind of just spew. So you can go to btcpolicy.org. That's our website where we post all of our research. I'm on Twitter at Matthew_Pines. And I will highlight for the audience, this is released today, we are organizing our 3rd annual Bitcoin Policy Summit in Washington, D.C. next Wednesday. It'll be our biggest event ever. We're probably going to be at capacity. The time we might even stop selling tickets because we're basically at capacity now. There might be, still a window of time. So by the time this airs, like try to buy a ticket at btcpolicysummit.org if you want to come. But we're going to be pretty packed. And it's going to be a full day with, I think, very high signal focused presentations by folks from the government, industry experts, human rights activists that are trying to bring tangible policy ideas to the table, essentially answering the question, now that America is at least rhetorically pro-Bitcoin, like what does that mean? And what should it focus on to actually make good on that rhetoric, right? So we want to be pretty tactical and tangible. I'll be doing a fireside chat with the deputy director of the CIA as an example. And immediately after that, we're going to have a discussion by with Matt Corallo presenting on the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, which is about protecting the right to use and develop open source software and non-custodial tools. And so that's kind of the theme. It's like the strategic aspects of Bitcoin as a global asset, a global network, and then the core ethos, the principles of Bitcoin as a peer-to-peer money and ensuring we have private private tools and non-custodial tools that people can use. And so we're going to encourage folks to attend. We'll also be live streaming it, and so you'll be able to catch the content. And then we're doing a day on the Hill the next day. So we're going to bring maybe 200 plus Bitcoiners to Capitol Hill, and go to dozens of offices and have them preach the good word. And so it's really fun. I'm really proud of the team at BPI. We're about 9 strong now, plus an intern, and we're organizing basically an 800-person summit with a set of executive roundtables the next day, a day on the Hill, and we haven't outsourced any of the management event stuff. It's like we're doing it all ourselves. So it's a bit crazy, but it's going to be a lot of fun, and I think it should be a pretty marquee event for Bitcoin policy in DC. So check it out if you want to come, and take a look at it on the live stream, which we'll be posting the links on our Twitter handle. So thanks for having me, Nick, and you're one of my favorite podcasts. So love to come on anytime.
Appreciate you. And Matt Pines tells us that Bitcoin is built specifically to respond to a dynamic network of incentives that is ever changing, and it's definitely built for the future. Matt Pines, I'm Nick Bhatia. We'll catch you guys next time.